Okay, we're talking about modern art, which means for our purposes up to 1950. I just began but had to interrupt because I had stepped in some message left by my dog on the floor. Some morning message. Okay, the best place to begin, I think, is with three of the post-impressionists. These would be Cezanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin, and Seurat. Okay, notice this is almost entirely a French affair. Either all of the painters are either French or at least living in France. So entirely did France and especially Paris dominate modern art in the first half of the century. Toward the end of the period, the center shifted a little bit toward America. After all, Europe had experienced 2 world wars and a lot of social movement, let's say. Okay, beginning with Cezanne. Cezanne for me is one of the 3... actually, I'm changing that now. Cezanne is near the top of painters, but the top is at the very top are 2: Titian, as I said the other day, and Rembrandt. And we have to talk about Rembrandt sometime. Rembrandt is, with Titian, the king of painters, I think. Cezanne is in a second category, and I just moved him there, actually, after holding him with Titian and Rembrandt at the very top for many years. But I'll say why, which is not so important to us, since I've said this much. Cezanne has to be shifted for a kind of lack of humanity. What a great painter, what an intellect, what a hero of art, what an example, romantic example for artists and people who want to devote their lives to something, anything. Hero because he single-mindedly pursued what he was doing, regardless of whether he was receiving any attention or not. Van Gogh did this too, and really even Gauguin did this. These guys had a heroic aspect of their lives. But what Cezanne lacks, now I realize, and I realized in talking about Titian the other day, is in the end, he's an aesthete, A-E-S-T-H-E-T-E, and he is caught up in the late 19th century aesthetic movement or aestheticism, as Van Gogh was not. Arguably, Gauguin was caught up in it too. Aesthetes and aesthetics are people who, quote, live for art, and people who, quote, regard art as the pinnacle of life's achievements and experiences. This, in the end, is a limitation. He was limited by the myths of his time. And I think I have said this before. Everyone, no matter who, is to some degree limited by the myths of his or her time. We can't get out of them. We breathe them. We have to see life in terms of them. If we're able to rise above the little myths of our times a little bit, this is remarkable enough, great enough, but no one can entirely. That is impossible. Cezanne's a good example of that, but everyone is. So for Cezanne, art, capital A, art for art's sake, life for art's sake, art equals life, art is reality. Things like this, these myths in the end are crippling because they're, I'm afraid, silly. Very silly. And when serious life gets held up to such things, then the silliness appears. Okay, nevertheless, what a hero. What a hero. And so he moves into the second category with Giotto, after all, my God, in Cook's little list. Okay, in what way did Cezanne generate modern art? Because most people would say he's the father of modern art. What did Cezanne actually do? Well, Cezanne, very, how shall I say, heroically, worked out a system of color and form that took me a long time to understand, and I'm not sure I understand it yet. But as his as his painting, his style evolved, after the initial phase, I better say some more about his life. By the time he was 20, he had decided he wanted to be an artist. His father was a wealthy businessman from the south of Spain, of France, Aix-en-Provence, X-A-I-X, en Provence. Okay, so father grudgingly sent him to Paris because the son wanted to study art, and he went to Paris and stayed there for about 10 years. But by the time he was 30, Dad was getting sick of this a little bit. And Cezanne had only produced these kind of violent paintings. He was a very emotional, extremely shy man. He grew up, by the way, a close friend and classmate of his from Aix was Zola, Émile Zola, who became a very famous novelist, a novelist of the realist, naturalist style, or not really style, creed, it's more like it. And the two of them kind of split, went separate ways later because, in a way, over this, because Cezanne, from a personal need, Cezanne set out to try to control his emotions by thought, by analysis, and that too is pretty heroic. Many have tried this different ways, but pretty heroic. And so his painting became a matter of imposing geometrical forms, especially cylinders, triangles, squares, imposing geometrical forms on the reality that he painted. And that, for me, kind of symbolizes this effort to gain self-mastery, to master those chaotic passions that were certainly in him. Now, from the aspect of color, he found some originality of color. He kind of created some colors, and he imposed these on reality too. And I think it could be seen as the same attempt, psychologically, the same attempt to get away from lurid, garish, flamboyant color, just like getting away from violence, mostly sexual violence, to some degree in his subject matter, and return to nature and impose his own mastery on nature. I'm sure no one's said it this extremely. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but he can be seen in that way, I think. And it helps to understand the man, and it helps to understand some of the limitations of his painting too. If you look at a late Cezanne, one of those dozens of views of Mont Sainte-Victoire, which was near his home, by the way, he had a mistress who was not an educated woman in Paris, fathered a child by her, never married her. No, yes he did. Yes he did. He did marry her. I'm sorry. He married her secretly. The son, Paul, who became an artist too, and an interesting man. But then the relationship did not go well, and Cezanne had to leave Paris. He continued to support her them. Meanwhile, Dad died. That's it. Dad died. So Cezanne moved to the family home outside Aix, which is a nice, large house out in the wilderness, really. Long driveway. And nearby was Mont Sainte-Victoire. Not a very tall mountain, modest mountain, but Cezanne was fascinated by it. So it became one of his central themes. I'm talking too much about Cezanne. I'm supposed to be talking about modern art. Let's just say the geometrical forms and the muted coloration became very important. By Cezanne's death in 1906, he had become a little famous. In 1905, the year before his death, there was a famous exhibit of a lot of his art, and suddenly people saw what an amazing, amazing man. This man who had received no public attention, absolutely none, as little as Van Gogh. From this point of view, these post-impressionists, especially more than the impressionists, the post-impressionists are examples of this romantic myth, which people who don't know much about art or literature love to embrace, of the neglected genius who, like a plant, lives alone in the wilderness and grows, and then dies, and then the world discovers his or her greatness after life. There haven't been many cases like this. Cezanne is arguably almost one. Van Gogh is absolutely the case, but Van Gogh's case is ideal for romantics. I'm a little romantic myself, but only a little, and it seems to me anyone who is very is going to distort art a lot. Art or anything. Okay, so Cezanne then became well known by 1905 already and died in 1906. Okay, now Van Gogh. Vincent, wonderful poor Vincent, a hero. Okay, his Starry Night is on my wall in my classroom. It's important to me. I think it's the best thing he ever did. And as I look at it more and more, I think it's true, and it makes him almost a very great painter. But I'm pretty sure he was a greater man than he was painter, although wonderful. His personal example I don't want to get involved in, or I will break down emotionally. The story is so powerful to everyone. And when one talks about his relationship with his brother and how his brother helped him, and the exchange of letters between them, wow, that is power. It's hard to find a better story, I think. Okay, but let's get away from that. So he lived heroically in relative poverty, especially, well, he lived in Paris for several years. He was supported by his brother Theo for about 10 years. He died at 37. So did Raphael, by the way. So did Caravaggio. So did several. Bizet. I became kind of obsessed with 37 as I approached it a long time ago, and found the list of people who died at 37 or almost 37 scary. Mozart, 35. It looks like 36, but he was actually 35. But those 37 guys, Raphael, a king. Vincent, a king. Caravaggio, a king. And there's a long list. Okay, so Dutch, religious fanatic kind of as a young man, kind of wanted to be a Christ, mentally unbalanced from early in his life. The remarkable thing about him, cutting it short, is that he lived as long as he did before he killed himself. And in living as long as he did, that he painted, especially in those last 3 years, so many paintings. I mean, here was just a person like Cezanne whose life became painting. But I don't think Vincent is quite the aesthete that Cezanne was. He lacks that limitation because he retained his humanity in a deeper sense. Now, I think I'll discuss Starry Night for a minute, because Starry Night's important for me. Everyone knows that that churning sky, everything churns in Vincent in his mature period, and it has meaning. It has meaning. Cezanne's has meaning too, but I think Vincent's subject matter was deeper than Cezanne's, and Starry Night is a good example of this, I think. In Starry Night, what we have is, I think, a Greek tragedy. Euripides is a little bit similar. I find similarities anyway. Because what we have is vast power, not God, vast power. And this power pervades and governs everything, anything it wants. And underneath is that little village, French of course, with a little church steeple sticking up into the sky, symbolic of human religion. But the disparity between these two is so huge. I'm reading maybe too much of my own thoughts here, but I don't think so. Into this. So man living his little life in his little village, which is his little universe, and that vast power, which is unknowable, unreachable, unappeasable, I think, unknowable, total mystery, which man will, of course, distort in any attempt to understand. That's what that picture means to me, and I think that's what that picture means anyway. I would dispute that. I don't know what the very learned art critics say, but I'm not sure they would disagree with me. So this painting really is a metaphysical statement, a huge statement about life, from also from a man who suffered deeply, a kind of hero, a hero of the human spirit. I think that's what Vincent is, especially when he painted that. His other paintings, there are other paintings that support this kind of view of a nature mysticism. I think that's what it is. But a nature mysticism that does not have as its object some benevolent, sentimentalized deity, sentimentalized and anthropomorphic, having human form. Our silly, pathetic, but inevitable tendency is to create gods in our own image, of course, or gods to whom we can relate, let's say, who look a lot and feel a lot and think a lot like we do. I'm sorry, but I think that really is silly. Could God assume this being, be this kind of God if God wants to? Of course, God, being omnipotent, could, but I think it's too silly. And Vincent's painting is a corrective to a lot of that, just like Euripides is a corrective to a lot of popular religion. This from a man who is not very educated, but blah blah blah. Okay, sorry. Cezanne and Vincent have dominated too much time here, but what's their contribution? Now we're ready. I'll leave aside Gauguin. Gauguin is mainly a colorist anyway. His radical contribution is color. Vincent too, really. That is, they take this bright yellow and a bright green, and they set them side by side. Vincent does. Gauguin invents more pink and pastels and sets them violently side by side. That's the legacy of those two guys. So one could oversimplify and say Cezanne, form, Vincent and Gauguin, color. It's tenable up to a point. Let's do the let's do the colorists first, because they produced Expressionism. The heroes of the Expressionists at first were Gauguin and Vincent. And the Expressionists, some French, the German is more of German style because it's so emotional. The French tend to shun, even ridicule, emotion. There have been some exceptions through history, but the French intelligence is analytical. It's the most analytical intelligence of all I know, if one can talk about these national tendencies. But to a certain extent one can, I think. The German, especially in artistic matters, is not analytical, but expressionist. The Italian is classic, tends again and again towards classical forms, classical simplicity, classical values. Up to a point, this is true. The British are left out, and of this, their genius is literary, pure and simple, not musical, not visual arts, not much, but literary, yes. Blah, 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 I'm not sure. One can. This has some truth, very general. Okay, so the German Expressionists, especially, they weren't all German, formed into. Okay, who were the first? Maybe the greatest expressionist of all was Matisse. He, not violent, but in color. Color became his god. And he only became a painter, a serious painter, when he was 40. He lived to be 86, I think, so he had a lengthy career. But color, color, color. Bright, simple colors. I have tried, but I have never been able to love Matisse. I don't quite see the greatness. I kind of admit it must be there, but I don't quite grasp it. It's hard to grasp, I think. But anyway, color, and he knew art. He knew art. And I'll leave Matisse aside for now. Now, the other expressionists concentrated on two German movements, Der Blaue Reiter and Die Brücke. I think Die Brücke came first. In 1913 and 1914, these artists were gathered in Munich, southern Germany. And there they put on a couple of exhibitions. Exhibits, Americans say exhibits, British say exhibitions. Anyway, and these were very important, and some famous painters for the future contributed to these. Gustav Klimt, who was the Austrian, pretty much expressionist. Emil Nolde, German. Bright colors, somewhat violent actions. Many of these guys liked violent actions too. Klimt highly sexual, but many of the others violent happenings. Beckmann, Max Beckmann, same, kind of disgusting. These guys were reacting a little bit to World War I, which began in 1914, so we were right on the edge of it in 1913 and 1914. Okay, let's turn the clock. Let's turn aside now to Cezanne's sons. Cezanne's sons were really mainly two, but they tended to dominate the first 20 years of painting, despite the people I've just said. Because these were Picasso in his Cubist period and Georges Braque. Braque and Picasso, when they did their works at the same time, it's almost impossible to tell them apart and say this one's Picasso, this is Braque. So much they thought and felt alike and agreed on things. Now let's turn it back a little bit and talk about Picasso, because Picasso is the biggest name of 20th century painting. No one else is even close. And I'm going to try to explain a little bit why. May we? Okay. Why? Why the greatness of Picasso? If the greatness of Picasso? It's such a difficult question, and that kind of evaluation is, there is no more difficult question in art. And some people will say, well, why is evaluation so important? To a person like me, it is, because I like to order, I guess. Now, inevitably, such evaluations oversimplify and distort, maybe, I don't know. But I think man tends to evaluate. We're looking for greatness. I suppose what we're looking for is greatness. We're looking for kindred souls who feel like we do. Heroic examples of a quest for an elusive, unfindable truth. And what strikes us as greatness. I'm looking for that, and I suspect most people aren't. Picasso is a problem, certainly. By the way, I've left out a lot. I'd love to, maybe we can talk about French Impressionism sometime and Post-Impressionism just as a separate lecture, because it's such a great topic. Maybe it seemed like I said a lot about Cezanne and Van Gogh, but I haven't. Like the self-portraits, that's worth a lot in itself. By the way, and I will make this little parenthetical excursion. I talk about Starry Night as his greatest painting. It is true that any painting contains metaphysical assumptions. That is, the person who paints something, like the person who writes something, assumes a view of life, assumes a view of man, assumes a view of knowledge, of truth. The bad artist is the one who is not aware of this, or whose view is trivial and silly and contemptible. Now, Vincent is making a huge statement in Starry Night. He makes a similar statement in other paintings, that especially dealing with nature, and one could even find a similar view in some of the tormented self-portraits. But Starry Night makes it on a grander scale. It makes a statement explicitly about the universe and how the universe seems to work, and is full of tragic intensity. Now, the self-portraits have tragic intensity too, no question. But Starry Night, in my opinion, is simply a more ambitious statement. Back to Picasso. Here's here's Starry Night. It's in New York City at the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art. You see that sky, that churning, vast power. That's not some teary-eyed, benevolent Christ smiling down on his child humanity. That's just power. Unknowable, the kind of power that, if anything governs the universe, has to be this. Down below, the cypress, by the way, the cypress tree is death. I left that out. Huge death. And notice that the power of death, as it shoots into that sky, compare that with the little church steeple, which I think I'm pointing at. There's little man in his little village, comfortable enough, but what a statement. What a statement. Now, Vincent was a Christian. He was an intense Christian. He wanted to be a missionary. He was a missionary for a while. He lived among the miserable coal miners in Holland for a while, maybe a couple of years, preaching to them. He lived on nothing. Most of his life he lived on nothing. From a certain point of view, I mean, what a spirit. What a spirit. And And then he turned all that energy and spiritual intensity to his art. Now I'm going to show another painting, another couple of paintings that illustrate what I mean. Just a second. Where are they? Okay. This kind of... Similar. First is Cypress shooting into the sky. And all that energy. But you can see this is not as ambitious as Starry Night. Similar. That nature, power of nature, having nothing to do with religious values. It's everywhere. Ah, here's an even better one. This is a good one. One of his last paintings. One of his last paintings in Auvergne, where he committed suicide. Excuse me? More minor mode, but the message is the same. Death has become a little more prevalent, though death is huge in Starry Night. Those black birds, that darkening sky that looms over and kind of suffocates the earth. Power. Is it peaceful? Okay, the earth is fruitful. The earth is fruitful. Not Starry Night. The earth is fruitful. It bears fruit. It's fertile. It's productive. But death rules. Death covers everything. This isn't quite as ambitious, though, as Starry Night, as I'm saying, and as I'll stop saying so often. And there are many others that offer a similar view of life, but this is the most ambitious. This is the great one. Now, I'll show you something else. Vincent is second only to Rembrandt in Western art anyway, in the form of self-portrait. Rembrandt is the master. The person who studies Rembrandt's self-portraits is watching a really is watching greatness. Vincent too, though Vincent only lived to be 37. Now I'm going to show quickly the variety and intensity of these things. The most disturbing one, I would say, remember, Vincent was, I haven't said this, but Vincent struggled against insanity. I better tell the story that everybody knows, but I hear many distorted versions of it. Vincent was living in the south, in Arles, in southern France, in a tiny house that he rented very cheaply, money from his brother, Theo, who was an art dealer in Paris, every month. Lonely, of course. He frequented prostitutes during much of his life. He begged Gauguin, whom he had met. They had met briefly in Paris, I think. Everyone who met Vincent kind of liked him, but didn't want to be around him. He was so intense. He was so, that look in his eye, I'm sure, was so disturbing. He was an unbalanced man. Kindly, spiritual, wanting to be a Christ. Really, he wanted to be a Christ. And when that failed, he turned more intensely to art. I would put it that way. And struggled against insanity. So when he went down to southern France, intensely alone, and starting to produce his really important art, we're talking about here 1896 maybe, Starry Night 1889. He died in 1890. Okay, so Gauguin. Gauguin seemed to him to be a kindred soul. What a disaster. So Vincent was almost basing his life on the possibility that Gauguin would deign, D-E-I-G-N, stoop to come and live with him, and they would do art together and talk about art together and laugh and drink and whatever together, and Vincent would have a chance at some kind of happiness. Gauguin came. But Gauguin, what a contrast. In some ways, it's the contrast between the Frenchman and the Dutchman, especially an extreme Dutchman like Vincent. And Gauguin was kind of an extreme Frenchman too. What do I mean by that? Gauguin, worldly, cynical, amused by the ironies of life, analytical, cool. Vincent, overtly or covertly hysterical. How could these two guys get along? They couldn't. The experiment lasted, I think, 3 months, maybe not even that long. And then one night they had an argument. They probably argued daily. Gauguin was, I think Gauguin was a larger man, and Gauguin was muscular and powerful. Vincent was a short man and not muscular or powerful, I think. So Gauguin, they were both drunk, I think, and Gauguin decided, I've had enough of this, I'm leaving. It was evening, I think, and he went out into the street. Poor Vincent, frantic, desperate, runs after him, trying to tell him, even force him to come back in and stay. Gauguin had had enough. And I don't blame Gauguin on this. Vincent was Vincent, wonderful man, but no human being could live with Vincent. I don't think Theo could have lived with Vincent. His saintly brother Theo couldn't have, I think. That's my own view. Of course, Gauguin was hard to take too, an egomaniac. So Gauguin kept going. Vincent went inside, absolutely in despair, sliced off the lobe of his ear, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and took it to a prostitute at a brothel nearby, whom he didn't know well. Probably he had been her customer a couple of times. But there's a tendency, I think, among Koreans to sentimentalize this and make this the woman he loved or some nonsense. That's nonsense. Blood gushing. He almost died that night. Someone came in and found him just bathed in blood. He was taken to a hospital and somehow survived. Spent months in the hospital and then removed to a psychiatric ward for the insane outside Arles. Spent the next year and a half there. Spent another year at another psychiatric ward. Then was released into the care of this Dr. Gachet, interesting man, a physician near Paris in Auvers. Now these were the great years of his art. These were the great years of his life. His years of recovery in the psychiatric ward, went out every day and painted, and then psychological, the first place at Arles and the second place Saint-Rémy, nearby, and then with Dr. Gachet. His greatest art is from those years. The heroic part is that he lived that time and was so productive. When he went to Auvers in 1890, I think he probably knew what he was going to do. He lived on the 6th floor walk-up in a little flat. Dr. Gachet lived in his home home nearby. So one day, I think in July or August, very soon after this painting, he went out into a field to paint, took a gun with him into the stomach. It didn't kill him though, because he had the strength to walk back to town, drag himself up those 6 floors to his little flat, lie in bed, and die. So, a suicide, but again, the miracle is that he held on as long as he did. And so, I think, heroically. In his art, okay, I don't like the jargon, but his art, that was his life really, and he had no attention or not much encouragement from anyone, except his brother maybe. Excuse me. Now, a couple of self-portraits. All of these from the later years. Most disturbing of all. This is a madman self-portrait, but a madman who knows he's mad. Now the churning, those strokes, the kind of violent strokes, will remind us of Vincent's classic style in Starry Night and most of his other paintings during the last 4 years of his life. But here, those strokes make a similar statement to the statement they make in Starry Night. That is, there's all this unknowable power that surrounds us, over which we have no control, which we cannot understand, which rather controls us when it wants to. Whimsical, unknowable, deeply disturbing. That's the vision here. Now, let's look at another. Here's the famous one after he sliced off his ear. He seems to have achieved a little serenity in this painting. The look in the eyes is more serene. And so the surrounding area is more serene too. We don't have these violent brush strokes. Some serenity, but it was brief. Is that serene? Is that a man at peace? I don't think so. That's Vincent, struggling with his demons. We all struggle with our demons, knowingly or unknowingly. Vincent struggled heroically, I think. What a man. A little more serene. The style is a little, kind of the agitated style, but it's under control. And that's one way to view Vincent, and it's easiest to view him with this in mind, in the self-portraits. There are about 40 of the self-portraits, just like there are 35 or 40 of Rembrandt too, both of them Dutch. Rembrandt, a hero of Vincent. They are the two great Dutch artists, and their affiliation is moving. Of course, that means the later man for the earlier man, Vincent for Rembrandt. They were quite different too. Okay, now, talking about Picasso, we'll do Picasso next. Then let's talk about Gauguin a little bit. The Impressionists have received so much attention, still receive so much attention, because they are fascinating people as well as fascinating artists. And guys like Vincent, and to a degree Gauguin, and Cezanne are heroes. That is, they are models for people who want to pursue something with as great intensity as they can, without receiving much encouragement or support or fame or wealth or anything for it. And this inspires a romantic streak in all of us. Gauguin had been a successful businessman in Paris, married, 4 children. As an adult, he became interested in art, and soon he was going to art classes, studios all the time. Then he took a break from his work to go to Brittany, out on the coast there. Normandy, Bretagne, Brittany, way out there. A kind of wild place. It never has been very French, I think. I've never been there, but a dialect that's so powerful and strange, un-French. Anyway, he went out there to paint, and this began, the drama begins here because he decided he's going to paint. He pretty much abandoned his family. He left them some money, but he was going to pursue painting, art. We have the adventures in Bretagne, and then the brief adventure with Vincent, which I've already mentioned to you, in Aix-en-Provence, or in Arles, down there. By the way, notice that a lot of Impressionist painting is associated with southern France. post-impressionist, maybe the greatest of them, Cezanne, is associated more with southern France, Provence, than with Paris, though really he learned to paint in Paris. My order has been skipping around today so much, I'm sorry. We were going to do all of modern art, but this has proved to be impossible. I'll tell you... Where should I go? Let's stick with the Impressionists, because we're not going to get far into the 20th century anyway. And really, I've talked only briefly about it in talking about the Expressionists and it's okay. Expressionists and the Cubists, and I barely said anything about the Cubists anyway. Okay, more about Cezanne. I think I'll talk about Cezanne for 10 minutes, and that'll be enough. Cezanne's topics, subject matter. What was this? I mentioned Mont Sainte-Victoire. His subjects can be divided into 6, as I recall. And this is very interesting. Most famous maybe are the still lifes. Paintings that show apples, pears arranged on a table. What he does is so remarkable because he paints the apple, but he intentionally distorts it. He intentionally distorts every object, intentionally distorts the perspective of the table. The table begins here and suddenly it's veering off here after a slight interruption. The jug is unreal. Distortion, subtle distortion. All of this done with the typical Cezanne colors is amazing. Well, what statement is he making? He's making a statement that art is not supposed to reflect, be a faithful version of reality. Art is art is art. Art cannot, and if it tries to imitate life, it does art a disservice. It reduces art to the level of photography. This is a reminder that photography changed art hugely. After photography, the pursuit of objective art, objective representation, realistic representation becomes absurd. Why? Because photography, of course, will do it better. What business does an artist have spending 6 months painting anything when a quick snapshot will do it as well? So that, of course, changes art completely. And Cezanne makes the final break of this kind. Why is Cezanne the father of us all, as Picasso said? Because he makes that statement, that art is art. He liberates the artists to do whatever they want. That's reason enough to call Cezanne the father of all modern art. And he did it better than any of them. His art is still greater than anybody's in the 20th centuries, certainly including Picasso's. And I think Picasso would say so too. His intensely intellectual, intensely thought out, understood, mastered, his mastery of his material and of his art is the final word of art can't go farther. It's just that he can't make a statement like Starry Night. He doesn't have the range and the humanity of Rembrandt or Titian, who stand above him. But he's right there, in my opinion, with Giotto and a few others. Maybe Velázquez, maybe Goya, maybe Raphael, select company. Okay, so that's Cezanne in these still lifes. Look at a Cezanne still life, and you see him distort these objects. You see him saying that my color will and my will are imposed upon this picture of art. Is Cezanne, the late work. All you need is the title here. This was an exhibit held at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. 1977. In fact, my mother gave me this for Christmas, inscribed from my mother, a wonderful gift. I spent a week in New York that year. I was living in England, in Cambridge. I went home for Christmas, spent a week there to visit my father and mother, and spent the whole week I went 5 times to see this exhibit, and spent hours there. Wow. Late Cezanne, there's Mont Sainte-Victoire right there. You can appreciate the colors, the just imposing of the human will on his material by color and form, shape. I'll show you now. It's in this book. It's from this book. Oh, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I'll skip some of that. There's the man. Oh, I will show you. Every day he'd go out and paint. Outside if the weather permitted. Alone, carrying his stuff, sitting down and painting. Alone most of the time. Setting up his easel there. Here's the man, now old, probably the year before his death. He never had to worry about poverty, but I think that doesn't matter. Either did Vincent, really, because his brother took care of him, so that's not a significant. That's not significant of anything. Now, the late works are difficult, and I want to show you only ones in color, and there aren't that many in this expensive book. Oh, good. 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 I want to find color. Come on, guys. Give me color. Okay. I want to find still life. I'll follow their order, because otherwise I'll be jumping around. First, portraits. Here's a not very well-known portrait, but look how Cezanne distorts everything. The man's elbow is out 3 feet. I mean, it's just unthinkable. Everything distorted. Tables, everything, if you look closely. And then those Cezanne colors, and these are not quite the typical ones, but here is this man imposing his will on his material. I'll show only color. The portraits, a couple of... He's starting to leave material reality here. Art takes over. The man disappears. We have only art, brushstrokes and color. The artist takes art where he wants art to go. And here's a watercolor, but it's the same thing. The man is disappearing. That's modern art. That's why he's the father of modern art. And he does this in everything, so we know it's his mind controlling this. Is that a recognizable scene? Barely. Just barely. Soon it will not be at all. It will be an arrangement of colors and shapes. Nature is disappearing. Just like the man disappeared. And Cezanne is doing this thoughtfully, consciously, willfully, and all alone. All alone. He does the same thing in all of these late things. That's just barely recognizable. I hope I can find some that are literally not recognizable. And we're getting there. It's more of the same. I don't know. That one. Just barely recognizable. So heroic that he did this all on his own, ignoring what other people were doing, not caring. I think not arrogant. Just he had his vision and he was going to pursue it, and the consequences really did not matter at all. Wow. I don't need to show you more. You see, though it's wonderful to look at them. I'd like to show you one of those. Okay, here's what's happening to Mont Sainte-Victoire. Is that the one on the cover? They're very similar. The views are very similar, but you can see the mountain is different in every painting, and the countryside there is not recognizable. It's geometrical forms imposed by the will of Cezanne, on nature. That's why he's the father of them all. Now, they very kindly in this book put Picasso's first great painting. It's not in color, but I think I'll hold it up anyway. 1907. Cezanne died in 1906. Here's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. People have maybe seen it. It's his first great painting, Picasso. And really, it's a tribute to Cezanne. And you can kind of recognize this. Picasso is going to carry these geometrical forms and shapes, though, much farther, and create Cubism. But Cubism obviously derives from Cezanne. Now, the other element in Picasso, maybe do this next time, in the same year, in Paris, there had been an exhibit of African art, tribal art. And Picasso was fascinated by these masks of these savage tribes, African tribes, and so that becomes part of the painting too. This painting is kind of Cezanne-esque in another sense. Cezanne with his fear of, early fascination of, but fear of sexuality and the human body. Picasso, believe it or not, had it too, although he had 6 wives. Strange introverted man who was forced to become a kind of public figure. But Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is about prostitutes. These women are prostitutes. Avignon here was a section, I think, of Paris. And so this painting is about his fear on a dreamlike level of the female body. Cezanne had done the same thing. I'll show you one, because that's one of the groups too. I have to show you a still life or two. Color. Love the still lifes. Okay, there. Good. Got it. Oh, let's get a good one here, though. I'd like to get a famous one. Oh, the death heads. Wow, wonderful. Okay. That'll do. Dark. I love his darks anyway. Everything distorted. Everything displaced. Expanded. Twisted. A little crazy. The table, crazy. The curtain, crazy. Everything crazy. Displaced by the will of the artist. But one has to look closely at first. But once, after finding it, one finds it everywhere. Now this human body thing, I think I'll show you a couple of things. In his earlier paintings, he had painted nudes, and these are disturbing nudes. Obviously, he was disturbed by the nudes. Over the years, he painted a lot of these nudes, but look what happens to them. They become more like geometrical figures, abstract figures. These aren't nudes. These are not human beings even. These are just like still lifes. These are apples and oranges, tables, statues, and curtains. That's what I mean. His art was, what unified it was, really I'd call it a desire for self-mastery. A more than desire, a will to self-mastery. Wonderful. Heroic. It's just that he never makes a big enough statement like Vincent does in Starry Night. I'm not saying Vincent's a greater painter. In my mind, unquestionably, Cezanne was the greater painter. Vincent, great man, heroic example, did at least one painting that I would call great, but Cezanne, intellect of thought. Vincent was an intellectual too, really. Cezanne's example was simply more important. So from summarizing here, from Vincent and Gauguin, I haven't talked much about Gauguin, but from Vincent and Gauguin we get the expressionist liberation of color. So color is liberated from the world. From Cezanne we get color, but more important, form, shape, liberated from the world. And so modern art, all of modern art still, is liberated from the objective world. Is it subjective? Yes. Yes, it is. It's unabashedly subjective, I think. It's also intellectual. Modern artist has to think. If he doesn't, it's not worth much, I think. Okay.